And I thought this would be a good way to try to help myself learn a little bit more about what the sensory processing problems were in the autistic population. Over the last 2 days, I've now learned that while these kids may look similar in terms of what their processing problems are, that the underlying mechanisms look like they're going to be quite different. And I think that it is a further statement for why we now really need to look at subsets of kids, because this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. I mean, you know that better than I do already. But it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all either in terms of its underlying biology, how you got there in the first place, which mechanisms are operating. I mean, there are probably many mechanisms and systems by which we get to the same endpoint. And I think this is something that we've come to in the autism world finally, that people are now talking about subsets in autism. And I think until we start doing that, it's going to be extremely challenging to try to understand where this is all coming from and how best to treat each of these groups. So I've found this extremely helpful this weekend. What I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to talk about the study that we've been doing with Dr. Levin and the group at Duke on the rat model. The second thing is going to be followed up by some of the anatomy work that we've been doing in the autistic brain as it relates to processing of multisensory information in general, although I'm not going to highlight necessarily the specifics of autism. And then thirdly, which I hope will be the most fun thing, and I hope it'll be worth waiting for, is the fact that I think that some of these sensory issues are going to play out in the medical world. I think there are medical disorders that are being missed, that are being impacted by sensory processing issues. And that because all of you are worried about, I'm being simplistic here, kids who don't like tags behind their neck, kids who don't like haircuts, I think this is also involving the internal nervous system as well as the external nervous system. We have two nervous systems. There's something called the autonomic nervous system, which governs your insides. And I think that there's an impact that's going on there that we haven't really talked about or appreciated, and it probably is going to be more challenging than not to take a look at. But I'd like to at least raise your index of suspicion at the end and to ask you at least to think about it in some form. Okay, so we'll start with the rat studies. As I said, I met Ed Levin at one of these meetings, and Ed was doing some work with pre-pulse inhibition, which you've heard about a lot over the last couple of days. And I said something like, well, is anybody looking at the brains of these rats? And he said no, and I said, well, why don't you send us a couple and we'll take a look. And at the time, it sounded like it was really going to be a piece of cake. You take a couple of brains, you stick them under the microscope, and it's done. This has been a labor of love. We've met with all kinds of glitches along the way, but I think that the findings now are at least pretty exciting in my view. And I don't want in any way to think that you walk out of here today to think that we found sort of the answer even in this particular model. I think we've done a specific experiment. I think there is some interesting data coming out of this. It doesn't mean that families now should go out and start giving their kids X or Y, which is often what happens after a meeting such as this, is that somebody hears a story about GABA, and the next thing you know, gobs of kids are being given GABA, or they're being given something else because of some experiment that somebody did. We're not even there yet. What we're talking about is mechanisms of action. Lucy had mentioned something about learning about the nervous system and where all of this is happening. If this data is in fact true, it looks like it's working at the synapse level. That is where the nerve cells contact with each other to communicate back and forth. And they do that both electrically and chemically, and we're looking mostly at the chemical level. So I think what we're going to tell you about is a little bit of a start. I think it's an exciting start. I think it validates all the things that you guys have believed all these years as to being a real neurological disorder, but it's a beginning, and I think that we still have much work to accomplish. So onward and upward. So the statement of the problem is as follows: that sensory modulation and processing relate to the inability to regulate responses to stimulation to which most people adapt easily. Lucy and her group have estimated that the prevalence in most kids is somewhere between 5 and 16%. And it can be seen in a number of clinical disorders, including autism, but also it could be seen without any known specific diagnoses as well.